Blessings, everyone. This is Reverend Aphren with the Four Pillars Proto Temple. All right, so at this point we are at the segment of our ritual where we're performing some sort of observance, whether it be an observance for a lunar celebration, whether it be an observance for a solar celebration, or whether it be simply just performing a magical or spiritual act. Now, I want to preface by saying that not every form of magic requires these preliminary rites. Some of them do if you feel that you want to bring in that stability from the quarters, you want to bring in that extra energy and that extra oomph from the guides or the deities or the ancestors, then absolutely you can go ahead and do that. However, not all magic requires those preliminary rites. It's really up to you. But suffice to say that if you're performing a religious observance, like for a holiday, then you would definitely perform the preliminary rites. That's almost standard. So now we've set our intentions. We've created our magical space. Up to this point, I need for you to understand that as you are performing the ritual, you are being incredibly mindful and incredibly concentrating incredibly on these nuances that I've mentioned. The nuances of visualization, making sure that you're visualizing all of these things, because that is the most important. Again, the visualizing, the intention setting, all of that is very important. Speaking the words is not as important, but again, as I mentioned before, we speak the words, we hear the words. We speak the words, we hear the words. So as you speak those words of intention, as you speak those words of invocation, as you speak those incantations, you hear them, you circumvent the brain, which then causes you to go to a spiritual place and perform this spiritual act, so long as you believe it to be so. So, be mindful of those things. When we are casting the magic circle, I need for you to see the magic circle. When we're invoking the quarters, I need for you to see and visualize that energy coming in, that energy being planted. Those, if you're using invoking pentagrams, that you're seeing those invoking pentagrams, that the energy is being anchored to those pentagrams, and those pentagrams are being used to create that space, almost like creating the walls of the temple. And when you invoke the deities, I need for you to make sure that you're lighting a candle or doing some sort of a anchoring act or anchoring physical activity, which is then anchoring and bringing in the energy and then visualizing or even feeling. And the better that you get at this, the more that you're going to be able to feel these things. And when I talked before in the previous segment of this series about how drained you can be by the time you're done with ritual, this is why. Because you've done all of this stuff. You've done all of this stuff to get to this point, and you're not even halfway through yet. So it can be very exhausting, especially energetically. So be mindful, if you are going to be performing these rites, that you are visualizing, you're setting those intentions, you're working and you're acting at those intentions, you're playing those intentions, and you're doing all of those little nuances, moving in a clockwise motion or moving in a counterclockwise motion, depending on what you're doing, and really sort of working it in that direction. So we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the actual spiritual act. So at this point in the ritual, now that you've done the preliminary work, we are at a place where our space, as well as ourselves, is prepared for the work that we're going to do. If we're performing a holiday celebration, then this would be the part of the ritual where we are experiencing the holiday. We may have prescribed rituals that we do for the holiday as a way of helping to connect us to the energy of that holiday. Several years ago, I formulated a series of rituals for each of the holidays as a way for people to have something to look forward to, like, oh hey, you know on Lunasa we always bake bread and we bless the bread during ritual. That's part of the holiday observance, where we're able to observe the holiday and we're able to do the same ritual year after year as a way for us to remember it and to connect with the energies. For Yule, we have a vigil where everyone lights candles and they make wishes on their candles, and they set those candles to burn all the way down, and they let that light bring light and love and strength to the god as he's being reborn. All of these things we do are in observance to these celebrations. Now, generally speaking, magic is not performed on holiday celebrations, and I believe that that's true to a certain extent. On Litha, we create a votive plaque that we write our wishes on. We bless them with the light and energy of the sun, and then we take them and we hang them outside so that the sun's light may shine upon these talismans that we've created. And as the wind and the rain and the sun and the snow and all of that weather begins to degrade the talisman that we made, it begins to cause the energy to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow until we're able to get what it is, the wish it is that we wrote. So that's a type of sympathetic magic, like most of the things that we do. So it is a type of magic, but we understand that we're doing it as observance for the holiday, and we're using that divine energy and those divine blessings to give us the blessing. So it is a type of magic, but it is a very specific type of magic, and it's more so being received from blessings of the gods because of that particular day, versus us generating that magical energy and sending it to our goal, which we'll talk about in just a second. So in observance of the holidays, generally we don't perform magic, we celebrate. So that celebration can look like many different things. Whoever's leading the ritual will have a ritual practice that they might do, which will then kind of put us in that, again, back in that mythic frame of mind, that mythic place, where we can then experience that myth, or we can interact with the mythic cycle by recreating that story and reenacting that story and enacting that story. So, for example, on Lunasa, we bake bread. That bread comes from flour. That flour comes from grain. That grain has been harvested. That grain is harvested. And of course, these people that are harvesting are not doing it in a ritual act, but we understand that it is a ritual act. It is a spiritual act, because we have worked so hard to take care of this grain, of this wheat, for example, that now it is the time of the year when the wheat is cut. So we have worked and built and spent energy and time and water and rain and sun and nutrients to get this grain to the level that it is. And then we harvest it. But that grain represents life, sort of in a microcosm. And we harvest it with the full understanding that we are allowing this grain to give its life to us, so that we can continue to live, so that we can continue to grow, so that we can have the nutrients and the strength to move on and to do the things that we need to do. So we harvest these grains as a spiritual act, as an understanding of the cycles of life, and we take that grain and we crush it and grind it into flour, and we take that flour and we bake it into bread. I bake it into bread. I don't know about you, but I bake it into bread. Then once I bake it into bread, we take that into ritual and we bless it in ritual. That grain turned bread is now sustenance for us. So our understanding is that the God becomes the Lord of the harvest, and the Lord of the harvest is giving his life to us so that we can live. And that is a basic truth of life. That is a basic truth of the universe. In order for us as humans to continue to live, we have to consume living things. We need to consume living animals. We need to consume living plants, or just previously living plants that have then been harvested and brought to our table. So we're reenacting that myth. We're reenacting that basic human truth. And we're bringing that to the forefront for that time. So as we practice these rituals, we get into a ritual pattern of being able to observe these truths in our lives based upon our worldview. And our worldview at that time, in the example that I gave of Lunasa, is the god becomes Lord of Harvest, which then gives his body, through the process of harvest, of reaping, gives his body to us that we might turn that body into food which we then eat. But of course, that Lord of the Harvest comes from Lord of the Sun, who has given his energy to the plants that the plants might then grow. And of course, nothing can grow without the light of the sun. So there's that solar aspect as well. The goddess, of course, is the goddess of earth, and her womb is what is giving life to these things. So we're reenacting that whole myth. And even though there might not be a specific myth or a specific story that we in general Wicca adhere to, the mythic cycle is this that I just mentioned. Lord of the Harvest gives his life to us that we may live and continue to grow, and use the energy which has been transferred from the sun into the grain, which then grows, which eventually is solar energy, that we then take in, because energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So it is simply solar energy which has been converted into plant energy, which is then grown, and then we eat it. I think I'm getting off topic here. I apologize. So with that being said, we take that, we eat it, and we're reenacting that myth. So whereas to normal people, if I were to just walk in the room and say, hey, look at this bread that I got. Isn't this bread great? I did it myself. They're going to be like, okay, thanks for the bread. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not, maybe you overcooked it. I don't know. But to us, that bread is a symbol, right? That bread is the symbol of the harvest. That symbol of the harvest encompasses all the things I just said, which harken back to the myth. And then through the ritual, starting from the time that I go to the grocery store and I buy that flour, to the time that I bake that bread, to the time that I sit it on the altar in ritual, to the time that I bless that bread, to the time that I consume that bread in ritual, in a ritualistic way, that entire process is the ritual. So now I have used the ritual to reenact the myth through the symbols. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So this part of the ritual is where all of that takes place. All of that wonderful, the mysteries. Those are the mysteries of Wicca. That's why Wicca is a mystery tradition, because those are the mysteries that we learn through practicing our myths and practicing our rituals. So, let's say that we have done all these preliminary rites for the purpose of magic, not for the purpose of ritual, for religious observance. That would be different. This is the time when we work our magic, and this video is not necessarily about magic and how to perform magic or the principles of magic. I have other videos on that. But this is the part of the ritual where we perform our magic. And one of the most important things that we do in this ritual, is create the cone of power. Okay? Now, the cone of power is a term that was popularized by Gerald Gardner, and this whole idea is that practitioners, and normally it's a group of people, will be doing something that is generating energy, whether that be through dancing, through singing, through clapping, through music making of some sort, some kind of instrument, whether it be drums or be some kind of a flute, or whatever it is, rhythmic, stamping your feet, clapping, what have you, dancing, any number of things. you go around and the group is doing this sort of energy raising exercise. And as the group is doing this energy raising exercise, they begin to build the energy, and they begin to build it and build it and build it and build it and build it until finally the energy has reached this point, if I may use the term climax, has sort of reached this climax where it's like, I can't even anymore. I've got to this point where it's just so powerful and it's overwhelming me that I could burst. Climax. So at that point, normally the ritual leader would then call a halt to whatever the energy raising experience is. That energy would then be directed toward the goal of the magic, and this is normally visualized as a cone. So as the people are moving about in a circle, the energy is raising until it kind of peaks at a cone, and that cone is sort of envisioned as being the central point where you are focusing your energies directly toward your goal. And then you send it. Normally there's this moment, this very intense and powerful moment where boom, you stop the energy raising, and normally at that point you're exhausted from raising so much energy from dancing or singing or clapping or stomping that you you have to almost sit down or lie down as a way to just relax for a moment, because you've worked up such a fervor. And at that point that energy is sent out to your goal, sent right out. The circle, as I mentioned before, contains that energy. And it almost becomes like a bubble. It becomes, imagine a bubble that you just kind of fill with air, a balloon that you fill with air. It just kind of gets bigger and fuller and fuller and fuller until finally somebody pops it. And as soon as they pop it, there it goes. So that is sort of the whole idea of the cone of power. So if you're using this ritual craft, like I've mentioned, for the goal of magic, I need for you to understand the purpose of doing all of the things that we just talked about. Casting the circle, calling the quarters, invoking the deities, creating sacred space. We're wiping the slate clean so there's no negativity. We're setting up our ritual space. We're recreating the cosmos. We're invoking the deities to give us the good energy and to bring us their power. We work this magic, and so at this point in the bubble, the only thing that's there is the energy that we've raised. No dirty old negative energy, that's all gone. Now the energy that we've raised is there, and we're sending it out. Let me tell you about something. In my temple, it has been a challenge to do that part, because I think generally people are self-conscious. They don't want to do things to be silly. They don't want to do things to make themselves look like a mockery. And I want to talk about that for a second, because going back to the very beginning when we talked about the magic circle and how the magic circle is creating and cutting a space between the mundane world and the spiritual world. We're putting ourselves into this different world. In this different world, sometimes things aren't as they appear. Sometimes things are different, especially when we talk in other videos when we've talked about magic. Sometimes magic may even be the opposite of what in the normal world we would assume something to be. It's taking on a different or an opposite life based upon how we're using it in ritual. And sometimes that's powerful. So if we go back all the way to the beginning of Gerald Gardner and that coven and covens before, and the whole inclination that they have to practicing skyclad, naked, think about England in the 1950s. Heck, think about America in the 1950s. If you were caught without your shirt on in front of anyone other than your spouse, it would be like a scandal, right? It would be like, oh my gosh. In some parts of the world today, that's still the same thing. Like, oh my goodness. So to be asked to be naked in a spiritual place, it really just ruins your mind, doesn't it? It kind of is like, I'm sorry, what you want me to get naked with a bunch of strangers, run around so all parts of me are flopping about in a really unflattering way. It's definitely a lot to ask, right? Like we don't think like this. We don't live our lives like this. So to be asked then to do that, we've already in our own way sort of circumvented our conscious mind. We're now putting ourselves into a position that is very different from one that we would normally be in. We're putting ourselves in a position where we are experiencing things in a different way. So there is something to be said for skyclad practice. I don't practice skyclad. Never have I ever practiced skyclad in a group of people. In private, yes, but in a group of people, no, because that's just not my sensibility. But again, there is something to be said for that. So we sometimes will do things like that to force ourselves into a different frame of mind and into a different situation. And there are many, many other ways of doing that. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this series about how lighting incense and smelling the incense, because most of us don't burn incense really on a regular basis. We really might only burn it when we're doing a tarot reading for ourselves, or we're meditating, or we're doing something spiritual. So to smell incense is going to automatically connect you with that spiritual sense. So as we work our magic, or as we practice our observances, we're continuing with this idea of living in the mythical cycle, in the mythical experience. So that is kind of where we're living at that point. Now, when we have completed our work and we've used our cone of power, or we've generated that energy through whatever activity we chose to use, and we send our magic out, for all intents and purposes, our ritual is completed at this point. But we have to remember our manners, because as of right now, by the time we've completed our magic or our religious observance, we need to be good hosts. You've invited people over to your house to observe this ritual. You can't just like all of a sudden ignore them, right? Like, can you imagine if you invited a friend over to visit and from that point on you kind of just ignored them? That really doesn't bode well for your relationship with that person, does it? So they're going to be like, wow, like, hello, I'm still here. Like, why would you just invite me over and then just ask me to do something for you and then just leave, or ignore me the rest of the night, like act like I'm not even there? So we need to practice our manners. So we need to make sure that as we continue, we go on, that we give thanks to the beings that we've invoked, whether it be ancestors, whether it be spirits, whether it be the guardians of the four directions, and we need to wrap up our ritual in the opposite way that we started it, for all intents and purposes. But before we do that, we're going to show our hospitality by providing an offering to those beings that we invited here in the first place. So in the next segment of this video, in the final installation of this video, we are going to talk about finishing up the ritual, and then we're also going to go ahead and talk about ritual tools. So stay tuned for part 3 of this series, and we'll see you then.